Dear Richard, I thank you for sending me George Saunders' Civil War Land in Bad Decline. I read and enjoyed it back in June, one of the many I've had to wade through in this third and thank God final year of service on the Literary Awards Committee of the Academy, the American Academy he's talking about. I'm glad to be winding up this task, but I'm also glad to say that this was one of the few books I really liked and regretted having to return it when I finished. Now you have erased that wrong, I guess. Its main rival, in my opinion, is Brad Watson's Last Days of the Dogman, another first novel contestant, or first stories, first fiction contestant, is what he means. Anyway, thanks again, and hope all's well in Oxford, Shelley. Brad's book went on to win the Sue Kaufman Prize. Sue Kaufman Award is what he was reading for, which is awarded to the best first fiction of the year, and that book really deserved it, and all the books that he gave us, the three books following that he gave us, and now this, I'm just so grateful for as a reader and a book. So welcome everyone. I'm going to turn it over to the readers.
So thank you very much, Richard. And I just wanted to, before Peter and Michael come up here, I wanted to just say a really big thank you to Square Books and just how good they've been to my dad. And you'll never know how much it means. I really don't have the words to express my thanks, because I wasn't really sure. I remember, Richard won't remember this, but and depending on what time it was, either late that night or early that morning, you definitely won't remember it. But when we were having a celebration of life here for him, which they were so kind to do also back in 2020, October of 21, I was standing next to Richard and I said, gosh, wouldn't it be neat, if they could, I wonder if there's any way to find some unfinished work. And I think the general feeling was probably not. Just be too hard to assemble all that, or where was it? And but it happened through I know a lot of his good friends that wanted to put things together and edit, like Michael and Caleb Johnson, who I didn't know was going to be here, but is here, and Jason Burge, who's a good friend of Caleb's, and of course Nell Hanley, and also Joy Williams. But it happened, and it's just been, and then Lynn Roberts, of course, contacted me and said that they wanted to do this, so I just want to say thanks very much, obviously. And I did also want to obviously thank Peter Horn and Michael Pettit, who they've come a long way from, Peter all the way from the Gulf Coast, and then Michael from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and then friends and family that are here. One of the things too, I want to mention this because it's one of the things I've been really proud of, and it's really a great thing that's happening with these past stories and these stories that are coming out. Is I think Dad was a lot thinking, gosh, I need to publish. I listen to these podcasts too, and he'll be on there and they'll say, all right, when are you going to publish next? It's going to be another 6 or 8 years. And but I've also, in several other podcast interviews, one actually with Caleb Johnson on Bookmark with Don Noble. I was listening to that, and Caleb was talking about, I think, Rick Bass and also Dad, and saying how instrumental that both those guys were. But he was saying how much, I know being at grad school out of the University of Wyoming, how much he had meant to getting, to helping you with your career, and how he took genuine interest in trying to help you along. And then probably like 2 weeks ago, somebody turned me on to this writer, relatively young guy. It's a fishing guide in Montana, I was telling Michael about this earlier. His name is Calvin Wink, and people were saying, "Oh, he kind of reminds me of Jim Harrison," you know. And I thought, well, I got to tune into this guy and maybe get one of his books. And during the interview, he says, "Yeah, this guy really helped me out a lot. The University of Wyoming was Brad Watson. He helped me get published, and I never would have known that." And I think that's something though that I had been told that right after he passed, that people would get me to the side and say, "You'll never know how much it meant to me that he kind of took. He might have been under stress, and we didn't even realize it, but he still took a big time out and went over and helped them with their writing careers, being a mentor." Taking the time away from himself to give. Now, the published works are really great, but I'm really proud of that as well. That's all I'll say. But again, thank you so much, Richard, and everybody at Square Books. And I'll turn it over to these guys. Want to put this mic here?
Yeah. So I'm Peter Horn, and I have the great privilege of thanks. Do I need one of those? Thank you. I have the great privilege of having been Brad's friend since around 1977 or 8, whenever he came to Tuscaloosa. We met not long after that. I'm not a writer. I'm just plain old working guy, and who happened to be somebody that Brad kept calling and wanted to do stuff with for some reason or another. And we had a lot of fun together raising 2 boys. And of course I knew Jason long before I had boys of my own, and he was a great example for them. But so one of the things that I always enjoyed about Brad's writing, and this really started when he was in graduate school, it was about dogs. He always talked about how dogs are so unself-conscious and how they just do what they do, and they do the best of it, and they live in the moment. And I just always loved that part. Unfortunately, Brad couldn't live like that at all. I mean, he did anything but that. But I wanted to read this one little thing, and then I'm going to read the shortest short story he ever wrote, just so I can say that I actually read that in front of a crowd of people. So, the dog, who'd been hiding somewhere in the house, crept into the bedroom, her head low, still trailing the leash clipped to her collar, her eyes wary and vulnerable. Then she crept back from the room again and heard her claws clicking across the kitchen linoleum and the sound of the leash dragging behind her way back to the den. It was not over. Surely she wouldn't stay forever. He was fairly certain of that, or she was fairly certain of that. She would have taken the dog, surely, if she had meant to be gone for good. She was right that he somehow had gotten rid of the gun. The whole thing was at least as absurd as anything that they'd ever done. And the gun was the most absurd thing he'd ever done. And you'll have to read the story to know what I'm talking about. It's a terrible argument. So, back in the den, the dog was not at all certain the woman would ever return. She had only watched the woman leave the house and drive sadly away in her vehicle without saying a word to her, the dog. Now the dog didn't know what she would do. She thought that at least this had to be partly her fault. With previous owners, before she'd escaped and been taken to the shelter, she'd been beaten simply for crossing one room to the next, for crapping in the very yard into which they had picked her own crap into, and for barking when the very real threat of another dog entering their yard had been imminent. She had protected them, defended their honor, their territory, and they had beaten her. It had scrambled her mind, and she ran away. She was captured and put into yet another cage. The man and the woman came by one day and took her home, and they were kind to her. But almost immediately, the daily loud barking and snarling started up. And even if she could only usually tell that it was about to start, she was always frightened and wanted to run away. Now, there she was beneath the coffee table, licking her paws with the leash fastened to her collar about her neck, and nowhere to go. No walk, no drive up into the mountains, no to chase squirrels, no quick trip to the prairie to jump jackrabbits, harass the cowardly pronghorn herd. She could trip open the back screen, jump the fence, walk away to another man or woman or couple who saw the leash and took her up. She could offer herself to someone else this way and take her chances. So the other thing was, I got back to my hotel about 2:30 or 3 o'clock and opened my computer and opened up the Washington Post, and right there on the front page of the internet version of today's Washington Post, there's a review of this book, and by Justin Taylor, and he's obviously read a lot of Brad's stuff because it's a knowledgeable review, and he speaks very highly of Brad's previously published and written stuff and of the short stories that are in this. So I urge you guys to get a hold of that when you can. So here is Brad's shortest short story, Binary Eclipse. The Kronos twins always go to the gym together, always work out in sync, or so you might say. Balding, they shave their heads, black socks and their high-top sneakers, pale legs like young birch trees, knees like the trees' low limbs sawed off and gummed over. Their torsos, full, heavy feet sacks. Their arms, long balonies, bent and crimped where the elbows would normally be. Their faces, fiercely non-committal. Each stares into the gym's mirrored wall, during and between sets, but never looks at the other. Between sets, their mirrored flexing but not parallel does not mirror the others, but achieves a kind of strange choreography, like the shuffling of elements in a pod. One has large ears, the other small. One looks very old, the other young. One speaks American, the other Chinese. One thinks quantity, the other thinks form. One life is continuous, the other death by swift and violent annihilation. One love, the other indifference. One beauty, the other swans on a pond, who will be named, entirely unknown to the swans themselves, by an intelligent colony of bonobos on the shore. And that's it. Thank you, Michael.
I want to echo the thanks. I want to echo the thanks to Square Books for their early and continuing recognition and support of Brad Watson's talent. Thanks go to Nell Hanley and Elaine Mason for the honor of including a few lines from Watson poems in There's Happiness, which allows me to accompany Brad into the hereafter. Thanks go to Jason Watson for the invitation to join this celebration of his father's life, too short by any measure. I did note and appreciate the language of Square Book's announcement of this evening, in which Brad appears as a Southern fiction titan. Those of us who knew him know how delighted yet puzzled he would be to be called a titan anything. Brad might have been more comfortable with the description of Joy Williams of his freakish flair, or Square Book's notation of his lovely and strange melancholy. I remember Brad in one telephone conversation over martinis telling me how his vulnerability was so attractive to women who would want to take care of him. Until, of course, that same vulnerability drove them away, thus melancholy. I do know that Brad, like our friend Barry Hanna, wrote with profound courage sentences that were profoundly courageous, characters and scenes and stories that were courageously written. One often felt like a straight man reading his work. You can't say that, but Brad could and did. I'd like to read one of those Watson poems, which I've been writing since I've known Brad almost 44 years ago. Just because they were so kind as to include it. It was one of the first Watson poems I read. We were in graduate school at Alabama together. And I remember this poem came out of a lunch in which we were discussing things, and Brad's psyche came out, and it was the stimulus for the poem. It's called Blue Angel. It goes time, indolence, boredom, depression, and Watson figures his way out is at twice the speed of sound. It's booze tonight, though, sitting home with thoughts of Navy jets, Mach 2, and the blues he'll leave behind, like the sudden sonic boom that shatters the farmer's rain gauges, drives his milk cows and wife crazy. Watson uncorks his bottle, already over the next flat state, delighted and busy doing a swift 1,500 miles per hour. Glassy-eyed, he turns the pages of a glossy book. F-104 Starfighters, the XP-86 Saberjet, an F-4 Phantom. Behind each dark-tinted canopy, he sees his own face, composed, handsome, heroic. And it's there amid the debris of an air show disaster, the 4 fires on the desert, the 4 perfect black columns of smoke. Oh, to be a blue angel burning, becoming holy and finally air. Watson knows how, step by step, the soul can die in the living body. He'll make sure they go together, and when they do, go quick. Brad wanted to fly, and he not only wanted to fly, but he wanted to fly combat. This was in graduate school. And so he figured out the best way for him to fly combat was to enlist in the Israeli Air Force, which he tried to do. But they declined. He was an inch too short. And we're all the beneficiaries because we got to see this rather than Brad being lowered into the ground. I'm going to read a couple of little things and then see how far I get on another short story of his. Okay, one of the things Brad did so expertly was create characters and or reveal characters. There's some kind of notable lines in Flannery O'Connor's book of nonfiction, and Flannery O'Connor gave the book, a book of stories to a friend, a country woman, she was described as, down the road. And the woman takes it back to Flannery O'Connor and says, Well, them stories just gone and shown how some folks would do. And it's absolutely true. I'm going to read just a couple of little passages from a story that I know he wrote when we were in graduate school together. This is called Are You Mr. Lonely? And lonely is spelled Lonellee. Are you Mr. Lonely? I thought I heard a woman sneaking up on me in the grass. This is the predatory season for women, when men lie pale and naked in their yards like dazed birds. I let my head drop casually over the side of the lawn chair, open one eye, look. No woman. It could have been the birds. You never know what will come up from behind. I take a shot from my flask and shift in the lawn chair. Even the mailman crossing the yard to the neighbor's house can make me jump and stare. 2 days ago, this woman snuck up on me and watched me for 5 minutes before I knew she was there. I jumped up, and the beer resting on my stomach spilled. "Look out there, cowboy," she said. She was stunning. Very young, tall, and tan, wearing jeans and a t-shirt that didn't cover her brown belly, where there was a single gold ring piercing her navel. Her hair, maybe a natural blonde, was cut short and stood up on her head as if she'd been shocked. But her expression was calm. She sat down on the edge of the lawn chair and took a sip of what was left of my beer. "Are you Conroy?" I nodded and glanced at her navel. "Who are you?" "I'm working on that," she said, with a little laugh from her throat. She drained the rest of my beer. "All right," I said, for I've been trying to loosen up a little the last few months. "I got your name off the mailbox," she said. I love that. Now, whenever anybody asks, "Who are you?" just say, "I'm working on that," and it's liable to be the truth. Later on in the story, thank you for the extra 10 minutes there, Peter.
I'm sure you can fill it.
I could say it. This is later on in Are You Mr. Lonely? My wife and I had run a 2-person ad shop downtown in the 3-foot building. I often worked there until very late, so I fixed up a small day bed for cat naps. There was a men's room down the hall where I could take bird baths. I lived there for almost a month. Things went fine until one night Cruz, the night watchman, dropped in on me with a bottle of Ezra Brooks. "You look like you could use a drink, Mr. Conroy." Cruz was retired from the city water and sewer department. He carried a fat radio to call the cops if he had to, but no gun. He was tall, shaved his head to hide the gray hair, generally had an air about him of a man of leisure. He walked like a hip cat, paddling his palms to the rear as he strode the halls like he was walking with some ease through water. Now, having knocked on and opened my office door, he stood in the opening, his old eyebrows raised. "Well," I said, "I don't think I've had a drink in 3 weeks." Cruz held the bottle up, hand poised to uncork the top. I thought about it a moment and motioned him in. "What's with the Mr. Conroy?" I said. "Just call me Conroy." "Oh, yes. Last names," Cruz said, "like gentlemen." He'd already been into the bottle and was affecting a dapper air. "Indeed," Cruz said. He poured me a slug of the bourbon into one of the Dixie cups he brought with him. We had a pretty good time. Cruz had a finger-snapping little shuffle dance he did. He sang "Good Morning Little Schoolgirl." I did Tom Waits grumbling through Long Way Home. We kept slugging the whiskey. I walked over to the window, unzipped, and lobbed a stream. down 11 stories through the neon light of old downtown. Cruz ran over and stuck his dirty old security cap under me, rasping out a laugh, and said, "Man, you're going to get us both arrested." I went ahead and emptied into his cap. He became sober-looking, thoughtful, then shook the cap out and put it back on his head, doubling over that raspy laugh again. "Hot damn," I said, "are you crazy?" "I'm not crazy, man. I'm just drunk." Now, I wanted to show you the Square Books hat that Brad gave me years ago. And I feel about like Conroy did every time I put this on my head, thinking, oh my God. I tried to trade it in for a new one at the other shop, and they said, "Get that thing out of here." You still good, Richard?
You're great.
We haven't lost your attention
You're
yet?
good. You're good.
Okay. Here's further on in Are You Mr. Lonely? This guy's, at the start of the story, he says his wife has passed away. But of course his wife hadn't passed away. She had dumped him. And he's nevertheless having a hard time. And there's, he's moved back into his old house. Miss Duke filed charges, and I spent a few hours at the police station with a lawyer working things out. She had no permit for the pistol she shot at me, and I certainly didn't want to press charges of attempted murder, so her lawyer persuaded her to drop the charges of breaking and entering and assault. The pellet I'd shot at her had sunk a couple of inches into one of her arms. I paid for her outpatient surgery to have it removed. A few weeks after it was all over, I made the mistake of spilling my heart to a lady down the street, a nosy old widow named Mrs. Nash. She'd been bringing me jars of fresh homemade soup and chili ever since I'd come home, and she seemed very nice and concerned. So one day, I broke down and told her everything. The worst part of it was that I confessed I was about to die of being lonely. That I wished I just had a good friend, and so on. After that, people in the street just looked away when I drove by, and their awful children got a kick out of calling me on the phone. It would ring in the middle of the night, and when I answered, some kid would be on the other end. "Hello? Is this Mr. Lonely?" "Who?" "Is this Mr. Lonely?" "You must be lonely," said the boy's voice. "You kids cut it out," I said. "Oh, please don't be lonely." Mrs. Nash told them everything. The phone rang one night about 12:30, and I answered it without speaking. "Hey, mister, there's a naked fat woman in your front yard, and she has a gun." I was furious. "I'll kill you," I shouted into the phone. Great story. Another quick little introduction. As Peter rightly noted, Brad had a thing for dogs. Witness Last Days of the Dog Man. This story is called Agnes of Bob, and I'll read the introduction. Agnes Minkin, missing her left eye, and Bob the bulldog, missing his right, often sat together on their porch. Agnes in her straight-backed rocking chair, and Bob in her lap. Together, they could see anything coming. Bob to one side, and Agnes to the other. They always seemed to be staring straight ahead, but really, they were looking both ways. Whereas Bob's bad right eye was sewn up, Agnes had a false one that roved. It was obvious to her that people often had trouble telling which eye was the good one. So sometimes she would look at them a while with the good one, And then, when they become comfortable with this, she switched and looked at them with the false one, which was clear and had the direct hard-bearing frankness of detachment. In her good eyes' peripheral vision, she could see the general distress that this caused. How did he think up this stuff? That's another thing. When I put on this hat, I think it was on Brad's head when he was thinking up some of this stuff. It's a little bit disconcerting. I don't leave it on for too long. I'm in danger. I'm going to close with as much of a very short story as I can get through. You know, oftentimes we hear people say, you can't know how I felt, or unless you had been there, or unless you were in prison, you have no idea what it was like. Well, that's nonsense. If you have imagination, you can imagine your way into almost anything. In this next story, Brad imagines himself into a dog. It's called Seeing Eye. The dog came to the curb's edge and stopped. The man holding onto his halter stopped beside him. Across the street, the signal flashed, the words, "Don't walk." The dog saw the signal, but paid little notice. He was trained to see what mattered, the absence of moving traffic. The signal kept blinking. The cars kept driving through the intersection. He watched the cars, listened to the intensity of their engines, the arid whine of their tires. He listened for something he'd become accustomed to hearing, the buzz and tumbling of switches from the box on the pole next to them. The dog associated it with the imminent stopping of cars. He looked back over his right shoulder at the man who stood with his head cocked, listening to the traffic. A woman behind them spoke up. "Huh," she said, "the light's stuck." The dog looked at her and then turned back to watch the traffic, which continued to rush through the intersection without pause. "I'm going down a block," the woman said. She spoke to the man. "Would you like me to show you a detour? No telling how long this light will be." "No, thank you," the man said. "We'll just wait a bit." "Right, Buck?" The dog looked over his shoulder at the man, then watched the woman walk away. "Good luck," the woman said. The dog's ears stood up and he stiffened for a second. "She said luck, not buck," the man said, laughing easily and reaching down to scratch the dog's ears. He gripped the loose skin on Buck's neck with his right hand and gave him an affectionate shake. He continued to hold the halter guide loosely with his hand. The dog watched the traffic rush by. "We'll just wait here, Buck," the man said. "By the time we go a block out of our way, the light will have fixed itself." He cleared his throat and cocked his head as if listening for something. The dog dipped his head and shifted his shoulders in the halter. The man laughed softly. "If we went down a block, I bet that light would get stuck too. We'd be following some kind of traveling glitch across town. We could go for miles, then end up in some field, and a voice saying, 'I suppose you're wondering why I've summoned you here.'" It was the longest they'd ever stood waiting for traffic to stop. The dog saw people across the street wait momentarily, glance around, then leave. He watched the traffic. It began to have a hypnotic effect on him. The traffic, the blinking crossing signal, his focus on the next move, the crossing, on the implied courses of the pedestrians around them and those still waiting at the opposite curb, on the potential obstructions ahead, dissolved into the rare luxury of wandering attention. The sounds of the traffic grinding through the intersection were diminished to a small oral dot in the back of his mind, and he became aware of the regular bleat of a slow-turning box fan in an open window of the building behind him. Odd scents distinguished themselves in his nostrils and blended into a rich funk that swirled about the pedestrians who stopped next to him, a secret, aromatic history that eddied about him even as the pedestrians muttered among themselves and moved on. The hard, clean smell of new shoe leather seeped from air-conditioned shoes, overlaying the drift of worn leather and grime that eased from tiny musty pores in the sidewalk. He snuffled at them and sneezed. In trembling confusion, he was aware of all that was carried in the breeze, the strong odor of tobacco and the sharp rake of its smoke, the gasoline and exhaust fumes, and the stench of aging rubber, the fetid waves that rolled through it all from the garbage bins in the alleys and on the back street curbs. Anyway, that's kind of testament to Brad's ability to imagine himself into a character, in this case, Buck. I miss colors, Buck, the man would say. It's getting harder to remember them. The blue planet, I remember that. Pictures from space, from out in the blackness. Looking up from the intersection, Buck saw birds dart through the sky between buildings as quickly as they slipped past the open window at dawn. He heard their high-pitched cries so clearly that he saw their beady eyes, their barbed tongues flicking between their parted beaks. He salivated at the dusky taste of a dove he once held in his mouth. And in his most delicate bones, he felt the murmur of some incessant activity, the low hum beyond the visible world. His hackles rose and muscles tingled with electricity. There was a metallic whirring, like a big fat June bug stuck on its back, followed by the dull clunk of the switch in the traffic control box. Cars stopped. The lane opened up before them, and for a moment no one moved, as if the empty-eyed vehicles were not to be trusted, restrained only by some fragile miracle of faith. He felt the man carefully re-grip the leather harness. He felt the activity of the world spool down to the tight and rifled tunnel of their path. "Forward, Buck," said the man. He leaned into the harness and moved them into the world. Thank you, Brad. We'll never forget it. Thank you.
Thank you.